Section 3 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 2, Part 1. Galileo. I am inclined to believe that the intention of the sacred Scriptures is to give to mankind the information necessary for their salvation. But I do not hold it necessary to believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses, with speech, with intellect, intended that we should neglect the use of these, and seek by other means for knowledge which these are sufficient to procure for us, especially in a science like astronomy, of which so little notice is taken by the Scriptures, that none of the planets except the sun and moon, and once or twice only Venus, by the name of Lucifer, are so much as named at all. This therefore being granted, methinks that in the discussion of natural problems we ought not to begin at the authority of texts of Scriptures, but at sensible experiments and necessary demonstrations. Galileo. Galileo. With the history of Galileo and Copernicus there is connected a man of such stern and withal striking individuality that the story of the rise and evolution of astronomy cannot be told and this man's name left out. Giordano Bruno was born in 1548. His parents were obscure people, and his childhood and early education are enveloped in mystery. Occasional passages in his writings refer to his sympathy for outcast children, and he quotes the saying of Jesus, "Suffer little children to come unto me, and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." He then refers to himself as having been a waif and robbed of the love that was his due, the lawful legal heritage of every child, sent without its consent into a world of struggle and strife, where only love makes existence possible. Evidently the early life of Bruno was a symbol and shadow of what fate held in store for him. The first authentic knowledge we have of Bruno was when he was 22 years old. He was then a Dominican monk, and he is brought to our attention because he distinguished himself by incurring the displeasure of his superiors. His particular offense was that he had declared, "The infallibility of the Pope is only in matters spiritual, and does not apply to the science of material things." Strangely enough, these words of Bruno are almost identical with words recently expressed by Cardinal Sotoli. The difference in their reception is owing to a mere matter of a few hundred years. Truth is a question of time and place. Bruno was banished for his temerity, and Sotoli wears the red hat. Verily, yesterday's heresy is today's orthodoxy. The attitude of the Church toward the teachings of Copernicus after the death of the man was one of patronizing pity. Instead of putting his great book, Revolutions of the Heavenly Bodies, on the index, the wiser plan was adopted of paying no attention to it. Occasionally, however, the subject was broached by some incautious novitiate, and then the custom was to treat the Copernican theory as a mere hypothesis, and its author as a mental defective. Bruno would not have it so. To him it was a very important matter whether the sun revolved around the earth, as the priests taught, or the earth revolved around the sun, as set forth in the work of Copernicus. He came to the conclusion that Copernicus was right, and said so. It was ordered that he should cease lecturing on the subject of astronomy and apply himself to spiritual matters. He argued that he should be allowed to think and speak what he pleased about the stars, since the whole matter was one of opinion, and even the Pope did not know positively the final facts of astronomy, and if the Copernican theory was a hypothesis, so also was the Ptolemaic theory held by the Church. It will be seen that Copernicus and Bruno were very different in temperament. One was gentle, diplomatic, cautious; the other was headstrong, firm, and full of argument. Bruno was given his choice: to cease the study of astronomy, or to lay aside the Dominican frock. The hardihood of the young man was seen in that he unfrocked himself, thinking that once outside of the order he was not responsible to his superior, and could teach what he pleased, so long as it was not heresy. Heresy is treason to the Church, but Bruno could not see how spiritual dogma could cover the facts of physical science, since new facts were constantly being discovered, and the material universe could only be understood by being studied. He was too innocent to comprehend that a vast majority of the people believed that popes, cardinals, and priests knew everything, and that when any branch of knowledge was questioned, it placed the priests in doubt. Certainly the Church has not opposed science; she has only opposed heresy. But the curious fact is that advancing science has usually been to the Church heretical. When Bruno opposed anything that the priests taught, he opposed the Church. He was warned to leave Rome; his life was in danger. He fled to Geneva, the home of Calvin. Here, he thought, surely he could speak and write as he chose. But alas, Protestantism cared even less about science than did the monks, and heresy to John Calvin was quite as serious a matter as it was to Calvin's competitor, the Pope of Rome. The Protestants of Geneva gave Bruno scant attention. They had never heard of Copernicus, and the movements of the stars were as nothing to them, since the world was soon to come to an end. The learned men were even then making mathematical calculations based on the prophecies of the Old Testament as to how soon the general destruction would take place. Bruno sought to argue them out of their childishness, with the result that he got himself marked as an infidel and a dangerous man. From Geneva he went to Lyons, then to Paris, where his personality made itself felt, and he was given a hearing at the university. Here he remained for several years, when he went to England, arriving there in 1584, the same year that a rustic by the name of William Shakespeare, from Stratford, reached London. Whether they ever met is doubtful. Bruno spoke 5 languages, and his polite accomplishments afforded him an immediate entry into the best circles of society. He was entertained at the home of Sir Philip Sidney, and afterward carried on an extensive correspondence with this prince of gentlemen. Greville presented Bruno to Queen Elizabeth, who invited him to lecture at the court on his favourite theme. This he did, and it is quite probable that the noble lords and ladies left calls, so they could be awakened when the lecture was over, and congratulate the speaker of the evening on his effort. At Oxford there were disputations where Bruno's faultless Latin impressed the pedants much more than did his argument, so they offered him a position as professor of languages, but this he smilingly declined, excusing himself on the grounds that he had important business on the Continent. And he had. Already they were collecting faggots for his benefit. He returned to Paris and began his lecturing on science. His arguments had convinced one person at least, and that was himself, that as the Church knew nothing of physical science, why possibly it stood in a like position regarding spiritual truth. That is to say, the so-called sacred truths were mere assumptions piled up to satisfy the people, and the ignorance and superstition of the many marked high water for the teaching of the priests. The business of the Church was to satisfy the people, and not enlighten them, for if the people became enlightened enough, they would see that they did not need the Church, and then where were the honours and the riches and the red hats? Bruno cleared his mind of its cobwebs by expression, just as we all do. That is what expression is for. The people really dictate to the priests what they shall teach. Moreover, the people absolutely refuse to listen to anything in which they do not believe, and decline to pay for preaching that is not done to their own dictation. The business then of the Church is to study carefully the ignorance of the people and conform to it. On this one thing does its stability depend. Therefore it must, as a matter of self-preservation, suppress any chance intellect that is ahead of its time, lest this man honeycomb the whole structure of churchly dogma. Bruno said that, just as the world seemed to stand still and the stars move around us, so did the Church seem to most people a fixed fact. But exactly the opposite was true. The Church moves as the people move, and unless men outside of the Church educate the people, or the people educate themselves, they will forever remain in darkness. Bruno offered to debate the question publicly with the Bishop of Paris. That worthy was no match for Bruno in point of oratory. But when we cannot answer a man's reasons, all is not lost, for we can at least call him vile names, and this is often quite as effectual as logic. The bishop launched a fusillade of theological lyddite at Bruno, declaring that any churchman who would so much as hold converse with such a wretch was disgraced forever, and that the propositions Bruno wished to argue were unthinkable to a self-respecting man. He declared that it was only the mercy of God that kept the lightning from striking Bruno dead, as he wrote his heresies. Matters were getting strained, and the authorities, fearing insurrection, acted upon the advice of the good bishop, and expelled Bruno from France. He went to Wittenberg in his innocence, intending to tack on the church door there his theses. But Wittenberg had no use for Bruno. He believed too much, or too little. Luther could not tell which. The University of Zurich now offered to let the exile come there and teach what he wished. Thither he journeyed, and there his restless mind seemed for the first time to find a home. His writings were slowly making head, and around him there clustered a goodly group of students who believed in him and loved him. In the midst of this oasis in a troubled life, word came from some of the old-time friends he had known in Rome. They were now in Venice, and wished to have him come there and lecture. Bruno thought that his little leaven was leavening the whole lump. He was not without ambition. He was flattered by the invitation. He accepted it and went to Venice. It was simply a ruse to get the man within striking distance. Very soon after his arrival in Venice, he was arrested by agents of the Inquisition and secretly taken to Rome. He was lodged in a dungeon of the Castle Sant'Angelo. Just what his experience was there we cannot say. The horrors of it all are not ours, for no friend of Bruno's was allowed to approach, and what he there wrote was destroyed. We do know, however, that he was asked to recant, and we know he refused. We also know that he repeated his heresies and hurled back into the teeth of his accusers the invective they heaped upon him. Bribery, persuasion, threat, and torture were tried in turn, but all in vain, for Bruno would not swerve. Unlike Savonarola, his quivering flesh could not wring from his heart an apology. He scorned the rack and thumbscrew, declaring they could not reach his soul. He knew that death would be the end. He prayed for it, and even thought to hasten it by an aggravating manner and harshness of speech toward his captors, seemingly quite unnecessary. For 7 long years he was in prison. He was burned alive on the 7th of February, 1600, aged 52. When bound to the stake, he turned his face from the crucifix that was held before him and sought to kiss the faggots. His ashes were thrown to the four winds. Thus perished Bruno. In the year 1564, Galileo Galilei was born. Consequently, he was 36 years old when Bruno was executed. He had known Bruno, had attended many of his lectures, and had followed his career with interest. And while he agreed with him concerning the Copernican theory of the earth's revolution, he took exceptions to Bruno's arbitrary ways of presenting the matter, and also to his scathing criticisms of theology. At this time Galileo could not see that the extravagant words of Bruno were largely forced from him by the violence of the opposition he had encountered. Galileo fully believed that Bruno had been put to death for treason to the Church, and not on account of his astronomical teachings. These men had come up from totally different stations in life. Bruno was a man of the people, a self-made man, who bore upon his person the marks of the hammer. Galileo was of noble blood, and traced in ancestry to a Gonfalonier of Florence. From an early infancy he had enjoyed association with polite persons, and had sat on the knees of greatness. When 18 he was graduated from the University of Pisa, and at that early age his family and friends were comparing him, not without reason, to a genius who had come out of Tuscany some years before, Leonardo da Vinci. Parents either exaggerate the talents of their children or else belittle them. The woman who bore George Gordon called him "that lame brat," but we call him the poet Byron. Benjamin Franklin ran away from home, and his family thought themselves disgraced by his printed utterances. George Washington's mother, after being told that her son had been made commander in chief, laughed knowingly and said, "They don't know him as well as I do." Voltaire's father posted his son as irresponsible, tied up a legacy so the scapegrace could not waste it, invested good money in daily prayers to be said for the scapegrace's salvation, and then died of a broken heart, just as play actors do on the stage, only this man died sure enough. Alfred Tennyson at 13 wrote a poem addressed to his grandfather. The old gentleman gave him a guinea for it, and then wrote these words: "This is the first and last penny you will ever receive for writing poetry." The father of Shelley misquoted Job, and said, Oh, to be brought down to the grave in grief through the follies of an ungrateful child! And Labouchere says that one of the four brothers of Shakespeare used to explain that he wasn't the play actor who wrote Hamlet and Othello, lest mayhap his name should be smirched. Galileo's mother had that beautiful dream which I believe all good mothers have, that her son might be the savior of the world. As he grew to manhood, her faith in him did not relax. In childhood Galileo showed great skill in invention. He made curious toys with cogs and wheels and eccentrics, whittled out violins and transformed simple reeds into lutes, upon which he played music of his own composition. In fact, so great was his skill in music that at 20 they wished to make him official organist and choirmaster of the cathedral. His personal taste, however, ran more to painting. For some months he worked at his canvases with an ardor too great to last long. If ever a man was touched by the spirit of the Renaissance, it was surely young Galileo. The Archbishop of Pisa said, "Upon him has fallen the mantle of Michelangelo." He gave lectures on art and taught painting by actual example. One of his pupils and a great artist, Lodovico Cigoli, always maintained that it was to the inspiration and counsel of Galileo that he owed his success. There are really only two things to see at Pisa. One is the Leaning Tower, from which Galileo with his line and plummet made some of his most interesting experiments, and the other is the cathedral, where the visitor beholds the great bronze lamp that is suspended from the vaulted ceiling. When he was about 21, sitting in the silence of this church, which the passing years have only made more beautiful, he noticed that there was a slight swinging motion to this lamp. It was never still. Galileo set to work timing and measuring these oscillations, and he found that they were always done in exact measure and in perfect rhythm. This led some years later to perfecting an astronomical clock for measuring movements of the stars, and from this was originated the pendulum clock, where before we had depended on sundials. The endeavor of Galileo's parents had been to keep him ignorant of mathematics and practical life, that he might blossom forth as a saint who would sing and play and make pictures like those of Leonardo, and carve statues like Michelangelo, only better. But parents plan, and fate disposes. In 1583, Ostilio Ricci, the famous mathematician, chanced to be in Pisa, on his way from Rome to Milan, and gave a lecture at the court on geometry. Galileo was not interested in the theme, but he was in the speaker, so he attended the lecture. This action proved one of the pivotal points in his life. "Whether other people really teach us anything is a question," says Stanley Hall, "but they do sometimes give us impulses and make us find out for ourselves." Ricci made Galileo find out for himself. He turned to Archimedes from Plato. Geometry became a passion, and a very wise man has told us that we never accomplish anything, either good or bad, without passion. Passion means 100 pounds of steam on the boiler, with love sitting on the safety valve, when the blow-off is set for 50. It surely is risky business, I will admit. Accidents will occur occasionally, and explosions sometimes happen, but everything is risky, even life, since few get out of it alive. And so, to drop back to the original proposition, nothing great and sublime is ever done without passion. Galileo had his mechanical whooping cough, musical mumps, artistic measles, and now the hectic flush of mathematics burned on his cheeks. He talked and dreamed mathematics. Euclid was in the saddle. Ricci became interested in the talented young scholar, and remained longer at Pisa than he had intended, that they might sit up all night and surprise the rising sun, discussing beauties of dimensions and the wonders of dynamics. Together they went to Florence, where Ricci introduced his pupil as a pedagogic sample of the goods, just as Booker Washington usually takes with him on his travels a few ebony homobricks as his specimens from Tuskegee. The beauty and the grace of Galileo's speech and presence put the abstract Ricci in the shadow. The right man can make anything interesting, just as Dean Swift could write an entrancing essay with the broomstick as a central theme. The man's the thing, Hamlet to the contrary notwithstanding. Galileo knew the Florentine heart, and so he gave lectures on a Florentine, one Dante, who had loved a girl named Beatrice. The young Pisan drew diagrams of Dante's Inferno, and surely it was nobody else's. He gave its size, height, weight, and told how to reach it. He gave lectures on the hydrostatic balance and the centers of gravity, and then published them as serials. The Florentines crowned him with bay and enthusiastically proclaimed him the modern Archimedes. Pisa now put forth efforts to have her gifted son come home. There was always a rivalry between Pisa and Florence. Pisa could not afford to supply Florence her men of genius, let her depend upon production from home or go without. Galileo became professor of mathematics at the University of Pisa, a life position, or at least one he could hold during good behavior. One of the time-honored dictums of the day was that falling bodies fell with a velocity proportional to their weight. The question was first thrashed out in the classroom, and after Galileo had slyly gotten all of these scientific wiseacres to commit themselves, he invited them with their students to the Leaning Tower. Then he proved by ocular demonstrations that they were positively wrong. It is very beautiful to teach truth, but error should not be corrected with too much éclat. If the love of truth alone was the guiding impulse of Galileo, he might have secretly explained his theory to one of the wiseacres, and this wiseacre could have casually demonstrated it, so all the rest could have said, "That is what we always knew," and taught. Instead of this, Galileo compelled the entire faculty to back water and dine on fricasseed crow. They got even by calling him a scientific bastardino, and at his next lecture he was roundly hissed. Soon after he was bluntly informed that his office was to teach the young, and not to undo the old. And that is the way the troubles of Galileo began. He might then have apologized and slipped back into peace and obscurity, and later been tucked in by kind oblivion. But he had tasted blood, and the rabies of setting straight the scientific world for its own good was upon him. That he was wrong in the correction of his elders he would not for a moment admit, and he was even guilty of saying, "Antiquity cannot sanctify that which is wrong in reason and false in principle." Soon after he committed another faux pas by showing that a wonderful boat invented by Giovanni de' Medici for the purpose of fighting hostile ships would not work, since there were no men on board to guide it, and its automatic steering apparatus would as likely run its nose into land as into the hull of the enemy. He also decorated his argument with a few subtle touches as to the beauty of fighting battles without going to war and risking life and limb. Men who are not kind to the faults of royalty can hope for small favor in a monarchy, though the monarchy be a republic. Galileo was cut off the Standard Oil payroll and forced to apply to a teachers' agency that he might find employment. He did not wait long. The rival University of Padua tendered him a position on a silver platter, and the Paduans made much dole about how unfortunate it was that men could not teach truth in Italy, save at Padua, alas! The governing board of Padua made a great stroke in securing Galileo, and Pisa fell back on her Leaning Tower as her chief attraction. From a position of mediocrity, the University of Padua gradually rose to one of worldwide celebrity. Galileo remained at Padua from 1592 to 1610, which years are famous not alone through the wonderful inventions of Galileo, but because in that same interval of time at least 30 of Shakespeare's 37 plays were written. Surely God was smiling on the planet Earth. Galileo's salary was raised every year, starting at 200 florins until it reached over 1,000 florins, not to mention the numerous gifts from grateful pupils, old and young. Students came to Padua from all over the world to hear Galileo's lectures. Starting with only a common classroom, the audience increased so fast that a special auditorium was required that would seat 2,000 persons. It was during this time that Galileo invented the proportional compasses, an instrument now in use everywhere, without the slightest change having been made in it. He also invented the thermometer, but greatest, best, and most wonderful of all, he produced an instrument through which he could view the stars, and see them much magnified. With this instrument he saw heavenly bodies that had never been seen before. He beheld that Jupiter had satellites which moved in orbits, and that Venus revolved, showing different sides at different times, thus proving that which Copernicus declared was true, but which for lack of apparatus he could not prove. Galileo Galilei was proving to be more than a professor of mathematics. He was becoming a power in the world. The lever of his mighty mind was indeed finding a fulcrum. End of section 3.